West Townshend is a rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont. This is significant because that places West Townshend in the so-called Bennington Triangle, which is apparently one of the most haunted places in America. The Triangle is a loosely defined area that encompasses the ghost town Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered on the eponymous mountain in southwestern Vermont. The town was abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down, so as a result, the greater Glastonbury area that West Townshend is certainly a part of is now untouched, pristine wilderness that even by Vermont standards is incredibly rugged and remote. The Triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. Furthermore, over those 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of the so-called Bennington Monster, which is apparently this 8-foot-tall creature that roams the mountains of Glastonbury, and some people think that creature is behind many, if not all, of these strange disappearances. On November 23rd, 1943, 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. At some point during their hunt, the pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him, and so he assumed he must have gone back to their camp. But when Henry got back to camp, it was empty, and Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. Police show up, they launch the search. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Initially, Henry thought maybe he was still alive, so he ran over to him and rolled him over, and very quickly realized that no, Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl, apparently, was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. So the theory became Carl must have been out here by himself. He encountered a black bear. He fired one shot at the black bear. Thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him. The end. But not so fast. If Carl encountered a black bear and fired one shot into the animal based on the one found shell casing, that one shot is not going to be enough to put that animal down. Or very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear. And Carl, being a hunter, he would know that. And he would want to keep some distance with his weapon up aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire again. But even if Carl was really confident that one shot had taken the bear down, well, why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? Why did he place it against a tree and then walk 70 feet over to this animal that if it's not dead, it poses an enormous threat to you? You're all alone and unarmed with a huge bear that you've shot? No one's gonna do that. You're gonna carry your gun. But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, but the bear's not dead, he's lying in wait and he leaps up and attacks Carl. Even if that happened, black bears don't squeeze people to death. They might scratch you and bite you and rip you to pieces, but they don't squeeze you to death. And Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is, one, so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs, and two, happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? Makes you wonder. Ape Canyon is a gorge on the southeast portion of Mount St. Helens in the American state of Washington. The canyon is so named after a group of miners alleged that ape men, aka Bigfoot, attacked their cabin there in 1924. And if you want to learn more about that specific event, I covered it on my YouTube channel in an earlier video. It's right here. It's called Scariest Bigfoot Attacks, and I'll also include a link in the description. And while some people believe there are literally ape men running around this gorge on Mount St. Helens, there's never been a confirmed sighting. However, there was an event in 1950 that forced the general public to come to terms with the idea that there could be ape men running around Ape Canyon, or at least a large predator somewhere out there. In 1950, 32-year-old Jim Carter was a member of the National Ski Patrol at a ski area called the Milwaukee Bowl, which is in the state of Washington. Like everybody else on the ski patrol, Jim was a highly skilled skier and mountaineer. In May of that year, Jim was a part of a 20-person climbing party from Seattle, Washington. Their plan was to go to Mount St. Helens, hike up above the tree line, pick a spot, and then ski back down again. So the group arrives at Mount St. Helens, they hike up the mountain, they reach the spot where they want to ski down from, they sit down, they're putting their skis on, and Jim puts his on, and he says to the group, hey, why don't I ski down a little ways? I'll set up my camera on a tripod, and I'll take a picture of you guys as you pass, and then I'll follow you down to the bottom. And the group said, great, that sounds awesome. And Jim wanted to use his camera, so it was a win-win. So Jim, in full view of the entire group as they're getting ready, he skis down a little ways and then turns left into an area called Dog's Head, which was a little bit flatter than the area they were in, so probably a better spot to set up his tripod. But as soon as he turned left into that area, he was out of view of the main group. So after a few minutes, as the group is getting their stuff on, they took a little bit longer because they're trying to time it so they all leave at the same time because they want to get this picture all at once. And so they take a little bit extra time, they're all ready, and then finally they head down and they make that left. They're going to pass by Dog's Head specifically so Jim can take their picture. But when they bank around the corner, Jim's not there. And so they're looking around and they're saying to each other, did he tell us he was going somewhere else? Because it seemed an awful lot like he was going to Dog's Head, but obviously he's not here. And so someone said, well, maybe he got annoyed with us because we were taking so long to get ready up there and he just already went to the bottom. And so they agreed that's what he did. And so they got back together again and they headed down to the bottom. But when they got to the bottom, Jim wasn't there. And so they sat there for a few extra minutes looking up at the mountain, and they're kind of scanning down at the bottom and they're looking all over the place, but there's no sign of Jim. And so the group started to get really worried and they contacted authorities. When the first search team arrived, they went up to the area where the group thought Jim had been setting up at Dog's Head. And as they were looking around, all they could find was this discarded film box. So not any film or camera inside, just a box that would have held the film. It was kind of buried in the snow. Near this film box, they found Jim Carter's ski tracks, and they were not angled south towards the bottom of the mountain where the whole ski group had gone. They were angled east towards Ape Canyon. And they followed Jim's tracks, and they said they never deviated. They were total straight lines, like he was not trying to slow down. In fact, he was trying to go as fast as he possibly could. And at some point, he began leaping over these huge ice crevasses that if you mistimed, it's a death sentence. You're going into the crevasse. And he didn't just jump over one. He jumped over 2, 3, 4 at full speed without slowing down. And then his tracks got all the way to the edge where it overlooked Ape Canyon, and he went flying off. When the head of the search team saw this crazy ski line from Jim Carter, he said to the media that the only reason a guy like Jim, an expert skier who would never take risks like this, the only reason he would be skiing like this is if his life was in danger or if he was being pursued. So the search teams moved down into Ape Canyon, and for 5 days, 75 people combed the entirety of Ape Canyon up and back over and over and over again. They never found Jim, and they never found his skis or his camera or anything. And the whole time they were looking, those 75 searchers would report that anytime they were alone, they had the distinct feeling they were being watched. And it got so uncomfortable for many of them that they refused to go back into the gorge unless they had someone right next to them. After those 5 days of searching almost exclusively inside of Ape Canyon, they spent another 5 days not only continuing to search Ape Canyon, but also the surrounding areas. And finally, after 10 days of finding no trace of Jim Carter, the search was terminated. The only rational thing investigators could point to as the reason behind why this happened to Jim was he was diabetic and he had forgotten his insulin that day. So perhaps he became hypoglycemic and he became confused and then managed to ski off the cliff into Ape Canyon, where he landed in such a way that he remained hidden. Or, like the head of the search party seems to think, he was being pursued. He was skiing for his life. Whatever was chasing him had scared him so badly that he was skiing in a straight line down a cliff, jumping over ice crevasses before falling into Ape Canyon. And then presumably whatever forced him off the edge went down and scooped him up and took him away, and that's why they couldn't find him. But unless someone finds his body or finds some other piece of compelling evidence, we will probably never know for sure what happened to Jim Carter. Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountain range lies a small hunting camp that's been there since the 1950s. Despite its fame, only a handful of people know exactly where this camp is. But even if you were given explicit directions on how to get there, you might just walk past it because it's tucked away in the middle of the woods up on this mountain. It's just a small fire pit, a couple of logs around it, another log set up for cutting wood, and there's some paths that have been beaten down over the years from its occupants, but it's pretty much unremarkable. According to camp members, the fastest way to get to the site is by horseback, and it's approximately 8 miles, and it's through very rugged terrain on this mountain, and it includes a 4,000-foot elevation gain. However, this 8-mile trail is not marked, and every year it changes slightly because trees will fall along the way, changing the topography. Ron Moorhead, who's one of the 4 original camp members, laments the fact that anybody knows anything about this campsite. He wishes they could have kept it a secret, but he knew that wasn't an option after what they discovered there in late 1971. In early 1971, Ron was a young man, and he was invited out for the first time to the Sierra camp by the 3 founding members. When Ron got there, he fell in love. It was this beautiful, natural, pristine wilderness that overlooked this amazing valley, and they're surrounded by these huge white fir trees. There's a freshwater stream that trickled by, and in terms of hunting, the deer were plentiful. Ron said this campsite was the closest to heaven he thinks he'll ever get. The only real drawback of the site was the large bear population, but they always had guns on them, and they built this shelter out of heavy fallen timbers that they could go inside, shut the door, and they'd be protected from the bears until they left. When there wasn't a bear threat, they slept on the ground in tents. In late 1971, Ron came back to the camp with the other 3 founding members. They'd had a great day of hunting, and they were standing around the campfire just chatting with each other when they started hearing a grunting sound not far away from them in the forest. Now, typically, whenever a bear came to their campsite, it was usually at night, and they would hear it grunting somewhere off in the forest. And as soon as they heard it, they would stop and they would listen to kind of confirm it was a bear. And if it was, they would go inside of their shelter and they would wait for it to leave. But this time, when they stopped to listen to confirm it was a bear, the sound they heard next was something they had never heard before. And it was so frightening, they almost fell over each other running to get inside of the shelter. It was like a whooping sound you would expect from an ape, except instead of a series of whoops like you would expect from an ape, it was one loud whoop, and then silence, and then another creature somewhere else made a responding whoop that sounded different than the first. There was at least 2 creatures that were basically speaking to each other out in the forest out of view. Ron would say, as these creatures were howling and whooping at each other out in the forest, the men were huddled around inside of the shelter looking at each other like, what is that? Has anybody heard that sound before? And nobody knew what it was. And after a little while, they heard these creatures running towards the camp. They were pretty well off, but they heard these heavy footsteps approaching. And so Ron and the others, they put themselves up against these slats inside of the shelter where they could look out in the direction where these creatures were, and they're staring out just past the light of their campfire into the dark forest, and they hear these things running, and they stop. They don't come into the clearing. It's like they're just outside of where they could see, and then their tone completely changes. These creatures, which are now one on one side of the camp and one on the other, begin speaking to each other in a language that almost sounds human, but it was nonsensical. It sounded like an imitation of a human language, but not human. And so Ron and the others are terrified, and they're just staring through the slats, waiting to see this creature that's going to emerge at some point, but it never does. Instead, the creatures continue to stay outside of the light, and they move around behind their shelter out of view. And so Ron and the others move to the very middle of their shelter to get as far away from the walls as they can, because there are breaks in the walls, and they're worried one of these things is going to reach through and grab them. But finally, after hours of these creatures running around the perimeter of their camp, communicating in this totally otherworldly language, they started whooping again and ran off. And for the rest of the night, Ron and the other 3 stayed right in that shelter. The next day, when the sun came up, the men were out of that camp as fast as they could. These are hard, rugged men, and they were very shaken up by this experience. And they tried to talk about it, but there was just no way to describe what they were hearing and experiencing. And so they just decided they just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, and they'll deal with this later. But as soon as they got out of the woods and back to their homes, they didn't talk about it anymore, except Ron became obsessed with whatever it was that was making that sound. He so desperately wanted to find out what it was. And so he convinced the other 3 members to come with him and go back to the campsite, except this time Ron was going to bring an audio recorder and he was going to try to capture some audio of these creatures. And so the 4 men went back to the campsite. They didn't even hunt that day. They stayed right near the campsite. They made this big fire and they're all just kind of nervously sitting there waiting, kind of hoping it happens and also hoping it doesn't happen. And at some point in the evening, Ron said he heard footsteps way out in the middle of the forest and they sounded like they were running towards the camp. The 4 men sprint inside the shelter, lock it behind them, and Ron turns on the audio recorder. Now, before you listen to this famous recording, here are its bona fides. After being recorded, Ron sent it to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, and he and his team analyzed it, and they concluded that 1, it was unaltered, so it's not been edited, it's not been doctored in any way, it's an authentic audio recording. And 2, whatever was making the sounds could not have been a man, because their vocal range was dramatically higher and lower than that of a human's. The doctor said, based on average pitch and tract length, the creature that was making the sound most likely was between 7'3" and 8 feet tall. In addition to the Dr. Curlin examination, a cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also pointed out that it would have been nearly impossible in 1971 for Ron or any of the other hunters to dub the sound of their voices, which are on the recording, over the sounds that these creatures were making, because a couple times in the recording you hear both sets of voices happening at once. That's something you couldn't have done in 1971. Despite numerous attempts to debunk this recording, it still stands as a legitimate, unedited recording, although what they were recording is still a mystery. Have a listen.
There's 2 of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
He sounds like he talks to others and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, I just seen movement right through there.
Shortly after this recording was made, Ron stopped hunting at this camp. However, over the years, he has gone back several times because he's obsessed with trying to find out what's out in the forest, but he says to this day, he still has no. On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago, and all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, well, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. Luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with 2 hands and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Ravens spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs. But an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation, but apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her, and Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was or who did this to her. So really he had very little here other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He had also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Ravens' desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Ravens' Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe if that's what had happened to Ravens' Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them. And the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. And there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Raven's Jane Doe, but the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Raven's Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, "Oh, I'm sick with the flu." But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days, after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. He found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. He couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase. And when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful, he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, he panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America, and those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. The next story is called Cold and Calculating. On the morning of December 11th, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up, and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Leonid and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Leonid was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Leonid saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him, and he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. I mean, this is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Leonid and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Leonid hesitated, and so did some other men. I mean, this was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Leonid watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, I mean, Leonid was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat. And his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Leonid did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, the crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Leonid and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Leonid and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, the men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Leonid woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Leonid woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Leonid. Because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Leonid radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Leonid could die. As a result, Leonid would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that, he must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw 2 other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, hey, are you okay? And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel, and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go, and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges, and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty, and yet he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood, and the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out, and so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch long incision into his own abdomen accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid, because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy, and he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies, just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out, the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. In 2013, 46-year-old Paul Baxter started feeling sick. And then he developed a wicked cough that got so bad over a couple of days that he could barely speak because he was just coughing the entire time. And so he went to his doctor, who quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on a treatment plan. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. There, they did an x-ray of his chest and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker, but before they just put him under the knife and started cutting this out of his lung, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it and run it down into his lungs and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw this lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. And so he told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to try to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move around the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, and so he pulled the probe out, and he told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days when he could use a longer and more powerful probe. And so Paul looks at the doctor and he's like, well, what is it? What is this orange thing inside of my lungs? And the doctor said, honestly, I have no idea, but it's not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure, and the doctor, using this longer, more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lungs. And as soon as he pulled it free, there was a camera screen that was watching in real time what this probe was seeing. And so Paul and the doctor and the other doctors that were in there as well all got to see for the first time what this thing was. And it was this kind of triangular, small orange thing that nobody had seen before. And so as it was getting pulled pulled up and out of Paul's body, everyone's just watching the camera wondering what this thing is. And then finally the pinchers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. What it was holding on to was a small plastic orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. And as soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him, and he told the doctors when he was 7 years old, he swallowed, or so he thought, a cone that looked an awful lot like this one, except he hadn't swallowed it, he had inhaled it. And then somehow, for 40 plus years, he'd had no symptoms related to it until now when he developed that cough. Paul would say when he had this revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing because none of the doctors had seen anything like it before and didn't really know how to react to it. And so Paul was allowed to keep his traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London, where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor. There's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub, there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the two zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on CCTV footage, and it was also the day that they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside of Gareth's apartment was jacked way up, so it was very hot inside of his apartment, despite the fact it was summer, and it was the height of the summer in August. But regardless, the excessive heat in his apartment sped up the decomposition process and made it impossible to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth. although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death. On the afternoon of April 10th, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush had just finished classes at Seven Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He walked out the school's doors and began walking straight across towards the sophomore parking lot where his car, a minivan, was located. Although Kyle had suffered from a spinal cord injury at a young age, he had made a remarkable recovery. He not only walked after his injury, he ran. He went downhill skiing, he biked, he swam, he played soccer. But of all the sports he enjoyed playing, tennis was his favorite. He had joined the high school tennis team and had become one of their best and most popular players. That afternoon, he had a match scheduled, so he needed to get into his minivan and get out his tennis racket and his tennis shoes. And so he made it to the vehicle a little bit after 3 p.m. He slid open the door, he threw his backpack inside, and then he climbed towards the third row back seat of the van where his sneakers were sitting on the bench seat. And so he got to the third row, he turned around and sat down facing the front of the minivan. He took off his school shoes, put on his tennis shoes, and then he got up onto his knees and turned around. So he's facing the back of the van, his knees are on the third row seat, and he began reaching down into the trunk to reach for his bag that contained his tennis racket. And as he was reaching, the third row itself, what he was kneeling on, flipped backwards, dumping him headfirst into the trunk, except all of Kyle's body did not just go tumbling into the trunk space. Instead, his upper half made it about halfway down. He tumbled with the seat, and then he got stuck upside down when the top of that third row seat caught his chest and pressed it up against the back hatch of the van. And so Kyle's upside down, his hands are free in the trunk space, but they're too close to the ground where he can't really press himself out of this position he's in. And this third row seat that's come loose and trapped him like this, it's not locked in position. And so if he goes up at all, the seat goes with him. If he comes down at all, the seat comes with him. And so even trying to push himself back out again, he wouldn't be able to clear the seat because it would just come with him and then come back down again. And so he probably looked for places to pull himself down, hoping that might be a way to clear the obstruction, but there was nothing to grab onto, and his lower half would not have been able to slip through that gap even if the seat was stationary, because no person is supposed to get through that tiny little gap. There was also no inside handle on the back hatch that Kyle could have grabbed and potentially opened the back door. And so he was entirely reliant on somebody showing up and opening the trunk to get him out. But the scariest part of this situation was that that loose third row that came forward and trapped Kyle against the back of the van, it weighed nearly 100 pounds and it was driving against his chest. And so he would have had to fight with every breath he took in, pushing up that 100 pounds just to get a marginal breath. But worse than that, if Kyle didn't constantly put air into his chest and keep it full and inflated and strong, that seat would literally crush his chest and kill him. Kyle knew he had to find a way to signal someone that he was in this car. He couldn't reach his phone because it was up in his pants pocket, and that meant getting up around the obstruction, and he couldn't do that. But he had a smartphone and he knew he could use voice-assisted calling. And so at 3:14 p.m., he used his iPhone's voice assistant, Siri, to call 911. As soon as the dispatcher picked up, Kyle was frantic and he was yelling, "Help, help, help, I'm trapped in a minivan in the Seven Hills parking lot. Someone needs to get me out." But the dispatcher couldn't really understand what Kyle was saying because you gotta remember, Kyle is yelling from in the trunk space through this collapsed seat up to his phone in his pocket. And the dispatcher was just having a hard hard time understanding what he was saying. Although, if you listen to the audio, it's plainly clear that Kyle is in distress. You can hear that he's yelling, and you can hear him banging, which apparently is him banging on the inside of the car. And so they kept asking Kyle, where did you say you are? What's going on? But Kyle, he can't hear his phone. So Kyle just kept frantically repeating his situation, saying his name, where he was located, what was happening to him, in hopes that maybe somebody on the other end of the line would understand what was going on and would come save him. Towards the end of the call, Kyle tells the dispatcher that he thinks he's going to die here. And when the call does cut out, the dispatcher tries calling Kyle back, but it goes to voicemail, and his voicemail only indicated his name was Kyle. It didn't give a last name or anything about him. Not knowing if this was real or a hoax, the dispatcher wrongly labeled this call as unknown trouble when they broadcast it to police. And the dispatcher did not communicate that Kyle was obviously in distress. He was screaming and banging on something throughout the call, and even referenced that he thought he was going to die. Had the dispatcher given Kyle's call a higher priority, fire and rescue would have been alerted, and they could have used their advanced mapping technologies to pinpoint where Kyle's cell phone was, and they could have found him that way. Instead, local police were sent to the Seven Hills High School area to go look around the different parking lots that this caller could have been in. But there was nearly a dozen of these parking lots associated with the high school, making it a huge search area. And again, these police officers were not even aware what they were looking for. They were looking for unknown trouble associated with some caller somewhere around this huge high school. And so the police show up and begin kind of meandering through all these parking lots, staying in their vehicle, just kind of looking around, and they don't see any problems. Although in reality, they were right near Kyle the entire time. At 3:35 p.m., with the police still patrolling the parking lots around the high school, Kyle used Siri to call 911 again, and a different dispatcher answered. Now, at this point, it's been 21 minutes since Kyle's first 911 call, and so the weight of that third row is becoming unbearable. His voice is very weak, it's very faint, you can tell he has labored breathing, and every word is punctuated with a long silence as he tries to get out anything he can to try to help himself. And one of the things he says to the dispatcher as soon as they answer is, "If I die, I need you to tell my mother that I love her." And then there's a silence. And Kyle asks them, "Can you hear me?" And there's still a silence. And he says, "This is not a joke. I'm trapped in my gold minivan in the Seven Hills sophomore parking lot. If you don't get here soon, I'm going to die." There's another silence. And then Kyle says, "Hey Siri." And then there's silence. And he says, "Hey Siri" again and again and again. And then it goes silent. The second dispatcher had heard Kyle on this call, but for some reason did not relay to the patrolling officers in the area Kyle's dire situation or his exact position, that he was in this gold Honda Odyssey in the sophomore parking lot. For some reason, that was not communicated to those officers. And so 2 minutes after the second 911 call ended, those two officers left thinking there's nobody here, there's no trouble, and that was it. Kyle was left all alone. 6 hours later, Kyle's father went out looking for him after he didn't come home from his tennis match, and he found his son's minivan parked in the sophomore parking lot at the high school, and when he went up to it, it was too late. His son was still trapped upside down in the back in the trunk, and he had died after the third row had finally crushed his chest, causing him to asphyxiate. Kyle's family is in the middle of a wrongful death lawsuit filed against the city and several employees, and so the legal outcomes of this case are still pending. So that's gonna... In 2001, Greg Biggs was a 37-year-old self-employed bricklayer who was living in a homeless shelter in Fort Worth, Texas. He was also the father of one child. He had an 18-year-old son named Brandon who lived with Greg's ex-wife. Despite not living with his son while his son grew up, Greg had always made a point of spending lots of time with Brandon, and so over the years, they had become quite close. But besides his son, Greg really struggled to build meaningful long-term relationships with other people. It was like no matter how friendly and outgoing he was, people would just come into Greg's life and would leave very, very quickly. This made Greg, who always had struggled with his mental health, feel very isolated and lonely and desperate for human interaction. And so on the rare occasion where people did come into Greg's life, a new friend or a new love interest, he was always so excited to try to please them and keep them around that he would often go overboard with his generosity and his willingness to do things for these people, to the point where he really set himself up for being taken advantage of. Case in point, 2 years earlier, a woman had kind of suddenly come into Greg's life, and Greg very quickly fell in love with her. And early on in their relationship, this woman tells Greg that she's struggling financially. And without any hesitation, Greg started giving her all of his money. Now, Greg was not a wealthy man, not by a long shot, and so before long, he had literally given this woman all of his money to the point where Greg could no longer make truck payments, he couldn't make house payments, and so his vehicle and his home were repossessed. And then after he's suddenly homeless and destitute, this woman who he's given all his money to, she also disappears. But despite being in this horrible situation of sudden homelessness, Greg made the best of it. Anytime Greg was not working, he would be trying to make plans with his son Brandon to go walk around the mall downtown or go see a cheap afternoon movie. Times were definitely tough for Greg, but Greg stayed positive. He was a forever optimist, and he did this by focusing on the future. He was certain if he could just land a few more good-paying gigs, he could make that extra cash and finally buy a home again and buy a vehicle again and finally kind of get his life back together. But unfortunately, he would never get that chance. On the morning of October 27th, 2001, 2 men called the Fort Worth Police Department to report having seen something suspicious on a park bench inside of Cobb Park. Cobb Park is this big public park with playgrounds and walking trails and fields. And at the time, Cobb Park was not considered a very safe place to be, especially after hours. There was lots of shady people in the park. So when the Fort Worth Police Department gets a call about something shady happening in Cobb Park, they aren't surprised. And so they dispatch a single detective to go over to the park and meet these 2 guys and see whatever suspicious thing is on this park bench. And so this detective, he goes over to the gates of Cobb Park, he meets these 2 guys, and they kind of explain what they saw. They give him directions to this bench, and then he thanks them. He hops back in his cruiser, he drives through the gates, and he starts driving down the trail, and then he pulls off and parks his cruiser, knowing that the bench in question is right around the corner, maybe 200 or 300 feet away. And so he parks his cruiser, he gets out, and he starts walking on this cement path, and as he's walking, he can't see the bench yet, but as he's walking, he sees there are deep tire tracks in the grass and mud off to the right side of the walking path. So he's mentally kind of taking note that somebody had been driving inside the park fairly recently off the trail. And so he keeps on walking and he begins to make that turn, and he sees up ahead the bench in question, and he can clearly see these deep tire tracks go right up to the bench. And then as he begins to make that turn and he's maybe 30 or 40 feet away, he can actually see what's on this bench, and he can see this big lump that's kind of wrapped up in what looks like a rug or a blanket. And then as he gets closer and closer, he can finally see that very clearly there is a person inside of this blanket that's kind of laying out on this bench. And when he's about 10 or 15 feet away, he can see it's a man, and this man is clearly deceased. So this detective, he walks right over to the bench and he's looking down at this body, and he can see the right arm on this guy is very badly broken, and his right leg is also very badly broken. And then his left leg is not only broken, but it's been partially amputated. In fact, the left leg is barely hanging on. And so this detective, he's looking at this guy thinking, okay, this person must have gotten wrapped up in these shady criminal dealings that are known to take place in Cobb Park, and somebody beat him to death, or they beat him and then shot him to death. But as he's looking at the body, despite these extensive injuries, the bruising on his body was not consistent with someone who had been beaten to death. And in terms of potentially being shot to death, he began looking at the body, and from where he was standing, he could not see an entrance or an exit wound of a bullet. And so stumped, the detective steps back and is just kind of pondering what he's looking at when he realizes there's very little blood anywhere near the bench or on the body. And considering the left leg has been nearly amputated, you would think there would be lots and lots of blood, but there wasn't. And so that indicated to the detective that his injuries had to have been sustained elsewhere. And so this detective, he calls in backup, and more detectives show up, and they're all kind of looking at the scene, and the working theory became, okay, this guy got killed outside of the park. We don't know how he got killed. It looks like some sort of blunt force trauma, but somehow he gets killed outside of the park, and then his killers, they drive him into Cobb Park, which is why you have those deep tire tracks on the right side of the path, and they dump him on this bench. Later that day, the medical examiner would come out and positively identify the body as belonging to Greg Biggs. The same day that Greg was found, the police went out and began their investigation, and they started by interviewing people that had been in Cobb Park either that day or in recent days, and they also interviewed known criminals that they knew went into Cobb Park, and they reviewed CCTV footage both in the park and outside of the park. But no one knew anything about what happened to Greg, and the footage didn't show them anything interesting. And so very quickly, Greg's case began to languish, and no one knew what to make of it. Then, in February of 2002, so roughly 4 months after Greg was found, the Fort Worth Police Department received a phone call. It was from this young woman named Miranda Daniel, and she said, "I know what happened to the man in Cobb Park." And the story she would tell them at first was so hard to believe that the Fort Worth Police Department weren't sure if this was a prank or not. But when they followed up on her lead and they went to a very specific address that she had mentioned, they realized she was telling the truth. This is the unbelievable true story of what happened to Greg Biggs. On the evening of October 25th, 2001, so 36 hours before Greg was found in Cobb Park, 25-year-old nurse's assistant Shantae Mallard arrived at her friend's apartment in Fort Worth, Texas. Her friend was named Tittalisi Rice. She went by T-Fry. Shantae was from a very loving and stable household in Fort Worth, Texas. Her parents had raised her to be kind to other people and to always work hard and to stay out of trouble, and by and large, Shantae acted accordingly. But in her late teens and early 20s, Shantae began to secretly rebel against her parents. On the surface, when she was around her parents and her family, she was the goody two-shoes that always followed the rules. But when she was away from her family, specifically when she was with T-Fry, she would let her wild, rebellious side out. The two friends had met in 1999 at a nursing home where they both worked as nursing assistants. T-Fry had just gotten out of this very toxic marriage, and so when she met Shantae, she was actively looking for someone to go out and party with and go be free and meet other new people. And Shantae, when she's meeting T-Fry, she didn't necessarily know she wanted to do those things, but being around T-Fry, it was like this whole other side of life was opened up to her, and suddenly all she wanted was to go cut loose with T-Fry. And so very quickly, these two women really connected over their mutual desire to go have fun at any cost. And before long, they were not only drinking and doing drugs and partying on the weekends, but they were also getting high before work, which meant they were treating patients high. So with that in mind, fast forward back to October 25th, and Shantae has just arrived at T-Fry's apartment. And so Shantae, she goes up to T-Fry's apartment, and the two start drinking some alcohol, and they start smoking some weed, and they split an ecstasy pill. Ecstasy is a big party drug. It's kind of like a cross between being a stimulant and a psychedelic. And so after these two women are fairly buzzed on these different substances and they're feeling ready to go, they leave T-Fry's apartment, they go down and they climb into Shantae's car. And Shantae drives the two of them to a local club called Joe's Big Bamboo. And so the plan was they were going to meet this guy named Cleet Jackson, who was Shantae's love interest. And the plan was they would hang out at the club with Cleet, and then at the end of the night, they would all leave, and Shantae and Cleet were going to spend the night together. And so Shantae and T-Fry, they arrive in the parking lot of Joe's Big Bamboo. They park their car, they get out, and they meet up with Cleet, who was outside of the club, and the trio kind of sneak off from the rest of the people trying to get into the club, and they smoke some more marijuana, and then the trio, they go into the club, and they start having drinks, and they're partying, and they're dancing, and they're having this great time. And then at some point in the night, Cleet kind of abandons Shantae and T-Fry, and he goes off with another woman he met that night in the club, and he would actually leave the club with this other woman, and he would vanish for the night. And so around 2 a.m., when the club is getting ready to close, Shantae realizes that Cleet, the guy she was going to go home with, he's gone now. And so she's very frustrated, but she doesn't really have any recourse. And so she instead just goes and finds T-Fry and says, hey, let's just leave. And T-Fry, she's ready to leave too. And so the two women, they leave the club and they get out to Shantae's car, and both women are clearly under the influence. They're both definitely inebriated, but T-Fry believed she was less inebriated than Shantae was, and so she should drive. And so she told Shantae, get in the passenger seat, I'm going to drive. Shantae gets into the passenger seat, T-Fry gets in the driver's seat, and she leaves the club and she drives all the way back to her apartment. When she parks at her apartment, she gets out and says to Shantae, hey, I don't mind getting in my car and kind of trailing you as you drive back to your home to make sure you get home safe, kind of like an escort. And Shantae, she just gets out of the passenger side and walks right around and confidently sits in the driver's seat of her car and tells T-Fry, nope, I'm fine. I'm going to drive myself. I'll see you later. And then Shantae drove away. About an hour later, at 3:30 in the morning, T-Fry is in bed in her apartment when she gets this very frantic phone call from Shantae, who's totally hysterical. She's beside herself, and she's not really making any sense, but she's trying to get T-Fry to come over to her house. Now, T-Fry did attempt to figure out what was going on, but she just could not cut through the hysteria on the other side of the phone. And so eventually, T-Fry just thought, you know what? Clearly, it's something serious. I'm going to go see what's going on. And so T-Fry, she leaves her apartment, she gets in her car, and she drives over to Shantae's house. And when she gets there, she goes up to the front door, she opens it up, she walks inside, and she finds Shantae in the kitchen straight ahead. She's totally hysterical, she's crying, and she's telling T-Fry that she didn't mean to do it. She's so sorry. And T-Fry's telling her, hey, calm down, what's going on? And Shantae says, look in the garage. And so T-Fry, she walks straight ahead through the kitchen to the door in the kitchen that leads into Shantae's garage. And she opens the door up, she turns the light on, and in the middle of the garage is Shantae's car. It had been parked nose in and lodged head first in the windshield on the passenger side of this car was Greg Biggs. When Shantae had left T-Fry's house an hour earlier saying she was fine to drive, on her drive home, she had barreled into Greg, who was on a sidewalk of some street, and the impact was so hard that Greg went flying through the windshield and got lodged halfway inside of her car. But the impact didn't kill him. It did almost cut his left leg off and break several bones in his body, but it didn't kill him. In fact, there was blood spatter inside of the car on the passenger side that indicated Greg was totally conscious and was trying to pull himself back into the car. There were these handprints on the inside of the passenger side door indicating Greg had been pulling on them. There was also these very small droplets of blood all over the seat indicating that Greg had been spitting up blood as he was trying to talk to Shantae or as he was trying to plead for help. But Shantae, instead of stopping her car and getting this guy help, she just kept on driving home with Greg lodged in her front windshield. Now, keep in mind, where she hit him, she was less than a half mile from the fire station where her brother, her older brother, was currently on duty as a fireman. He was medically trained. He could have saved Greg's life. Also, the other firemen at the firehouse that she knew, that Shantae knew, they could have saved Greg's life. Also, less than 6 miles away from the point of impact was the local hospital, where, of course, they could have saved Greg's life. And then on her drive all the way back to her house with Greg halfway in her windshield, she would have passed by 9 payphones, where if you don't know anything about payphones, you can dial 911, so emergency services, and it doesn't charge you anything. So Shantae at any one of these payphones could have called medical personnel who could have saved Greg. Also, let's not forget, Shantae was medically trained. She was a nurse's assistant and understood basic life saving. But she did not use any of those resources. Instead, she just drove home. And when she got to her home, she drove her car with Greg in it into her garage. She shut the garage door. She gets out. And as Greg is literally moaning and probably pleading for help at this point, she just says, "I'm sorry," and then walks up to the door that leads into the kitchen of her home. She turns off the light in the garage, walks into her kitchen, and shuts the door behind her, trapping Greg in the garage in total darkness by himself. Then, after an hour of Shantae just being in her house with Greg slowly dying in the garage, she calls T-Fry. T-Fry comes over, she looks in the garage, she sees Greg, and T-Fry's reaction is she just totally loses it. She panics, and she's screaming at Shantae, "Call 911, call paramedics, call the police." But Shantae refused. She didn't really give a reason, but she just said, "No, I can't." And then shockingly, T-Fry also does not call anyone. The two of them just turn off the garage light again and shut the door and leave Greg, and they hop into T-Fry's car and they drive to T-Fry's apartment where they sleep for several hours. And then when they get up that morning, they go back over to Shantae's house and they check on Greg, who's now motionless. And at this point, Shantae, she calls Cleet Jackson, the guy who she was supposed to go home with at the club but had abandoned her for some other girl. She calls him and says, hey, I have this huge problem. I need you to come help me. And so Clete Jackson has no idea what he's walking into, but he goes to her house and he goes through her kitchen. She opens the door and he looks into the garage and he sees Greg in the window, and he's furious with Shantae because now he's gotten involved and he doesn't really know if Greg's alive, and he doesn't really know what to do because he's on parole, and if he gets wrapped up in this, he'll go back to jail. But he ultimately decides he's just going to help Shantae because he believes at this point Greg is dead. So there's nothing they can do to save Greg. And so that night, Clete gets in touch with his cousin Tyrone, and the two of them, they go into the garage and they lay out a carpet next to the car, and they both kind of awkwardly apologize to Greg, who's just stuck in the windowsill, and they yank him out, they put him into the carpet, they roll him up, they put him in the back of one of their cars, and they drive to Cobb Park. They go through the gates, they make their way over to that bench, and they drop him on the bench. There had been some discussion about maybe destroying the body, burning the body, but Clete felt strongly that they need to put his body out somewhere in public so at least his family can identify him and bury him. After his body was placed in the park, Shantae told Clete and Tyrone and T-Fry not to tell anyone, and they said they wouldn't. And within a week of Greg's body being discovered, Shantae was back at Joe's Big Bamboo partying it up as if nothing had ever happened. But eventually, T-Fry would tell a couple of her friends, and before long, word had gotten out. And one person found out about it that was kind of in the network of these people, this woman, Miranda Daniels, and she really didn't like Shantae. And so she was the one who actually called the police and turned her in. And when the Fort Worth police followed up on Miranda's tip, and they went to Shantae's house, they went into her garage, and there was her car with the windshield still obviously busted in from something being smashed through it. And there's blood all over the inside of the car, and there was some obvious attempts at trying to destroy evidence inside of the car. The seats had been taken out, some things had been burned, but none of the attempts Shantae had made had actually destroyed any of the evidence. During the trial, the medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Greg Biggs said his injuries would not have killed him right away. Now, he didn't know for sure how long he would have been alive, but he believed it could be as long as several hours or maybe even up to a whole day. And during that time, Greg was just trapped inside of this pitch black garage. No one's coming to help him, despite people coming in over and over again that he's pleading with to help him. And he would have been in excruciating pain. He's got several significant broken bones. His leg has been nearly amputated. He's got cuts all over his body. And he would have been trying to pull himself out of the windshield. And every movement he was making would have been sending the jagged pieces of metal and glass into his body. I mean, this is a drawn-out, horrible death. And during the trial, every single medical professional and every single law enforcement official said, had Shantae brought Greg to get medical attention at any point in the first couple of hours, just basic medical care, he would have lived. And so his death is entirely because of Shantae's absolute indifference. T-Fry would ultimately, in exchange for full immunity, testify against Shantae, and Shantae would ultimately be found guilty of murder of Greg Biggs, and she would be sentenced to 50 years in prison. She'll be eligible for parole in 2027.
In cause number 03715 D-Styled State of Texas versus Shantae Juan Mallard. Verdict form is to count one. We, the jury, having found the defendant, Shantae Juan Mallard, guilty of the offense of murder, assess her punishment at confinement in the institutional division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a period of 50 years.
As for Clete Jackson and his cousin Tyrone, they received 10 years and 9 years, respectively, for their role in the crime. During the victim impact statement portion of the trial, Brandon Biggs, Greg's son, he took the stand and he very eloquently told Shantae that he forgave her, and it seemed very genuine and it moved Shantae to tears. And then Brandon looked out at the audience where Shantae's family was and he said, you know, not only do I feel horrible for my family, but I feel bad for your family, Shantae, as well, because this crime has destroyed all of us.
In 1983, 23-year-old Tammy Ashcroft was engaged to 34-year-old Richard Sharp. The couple had bonded over their shared love of sailing, and generally they spent more time on the water than on land. In October of that year, a friend approached the couple and asked if they'd be willing to take their 44-foot yacht from Tahiti to San Diego. Though the trip would be over 4,000 miles long, significantly longer than any one trip either of them had ever taken on the open water, they both felt very confident in their seafaring abilities, and so they agreed to do it. The journey started out fine, but at the 2-week mark, when they were just north of the equator, they heard about a hurricane that could be making its way up to where they were going. And so even though they anticipated it would kind of peter out and actually not even hit them, they decided it was still in their best interest to try to sail completely away from the path of the storm to safer waters. But over the next couple of days, the storm only intensified and continued to change directions, making it really hard to predict where safer waters was going to be. And so Tammy and Richard kept desperately trying to get farther and farther away from the storm, but it was like every time they would change course and get farther away, the storm would speed up and change directions and still be coming straight for them. And so finally, it got to the point where Tammy and Richard realized they could not actually outpace the storm, that they would have to weather it. And so on the day it was going to hit them, they donned their rain gear and they boarded up the windows, and then they stood on the deck of their yacht looking out at the horizon as this Category 4 hurricane is just barreling straight towards them. Tammy would go on to say that she never fully appreciated just how terrifying being in a hurricane is out at sea until she was in one. She said it was a constant barrage of 50-foot waves that would literally launch the yacht. It would become airborne, and then it would come crashing down, and each time it landed, she felt like the boat was going to break in two, and then as soon as it did slam down, another wave would land on top of them. And so it just felt like at any moment the ship was just going to be consumed by the ocean. But Tammy and Richard were excellent sailors, and Richard was up in the cockpit, and he was doing everything he could to keep the boat from not flipping over. And after a little while, he had figured out a way to kind of ride the waves in such a way that they would not get totally tossed each time. And after a couple hours of just absolute chaos, it started to seem like they had made it through the worst of the storm, and that more than likely they were going to make it out of this thing relatively unharmed. And so around this time, as the storm was beginning to calm down, Richard is anchored in place in the cockpit. He's a safety line attached to him to the ground, so he's not going anywhere. And Tammy is just exhausted. It was just so stressful being through the storm. And Richard noticed, and he says, "Tammy, I got this up here. Go down into the cabin and just try to get some rest." And Tammy was very grateful, and she agreed. She opened the doors to the cabin, and she had made it all the way downstairs when she hears Richard yell out from up in the cockpit, "Oh my God!" before a rogue wave comes crashing into their boat head on, flipping the boat backwards like a backflip onto the top, so it's upside down in the water. And Tammy would say it felt like someone ripped the boat out from under her feet, and then she came crashing down and smashed her head and was knocked unconscious. When Tammy woke up 27 hours later, she was laying in the cabin against a chair and half on the ground, and she opens her eyes, and the cabin she's in is half submerged, and everything inside of it has either been thrown on the ground or it's been broken. There's papers, there's tools. I mean, the place is just a disaster down there, and she can tell the cabin is also slowly filling with water. After the boat had backflipped and Tammy had been knocked unconscious, it continued to get thrown around by waves before miraculously landing upright. Tammy could barely remember what happened, and she's totally overwhelmed by what she's seeing. She's in shock, and all she knows is she has to go up on deck to find Richard. And so she gets up and wades through the water. She gets to the stairs. She's yelling for Richard. She goes up on deck, and she looked around, and the boat was just ruined, and she's yelling for Richard. She's looking around. He's nowhere to be found. And then she looks up at the cockpit where she last saw him, and she can see his safety line that was attached to him, keeping him anchored to the boat, was now dangling off the back of the boat. She ran to the back. She looked, and the safety harness had actually come undone. It had been broken in the storm, and Richard was gone. He had been swept into the ocean, and he was not wearing a life jacket. And Tammy would say he had actually taken it off earlier in the storm and left it down in the cabin. And then when the storm was raging again, he was back up top, anchored in place, and just didn't think to go down and get it. And they both were just not thinking about it. It was just one of those things in a really chaotic situation that got overlooked. And while Tammy wanted to grieve the loss of her fiance, it was like she couldn't. Her survival instincts were kicking in, and she knew if she didn't act quickly to fix this situation, she too would die. And so she began robotically taking stock of the boat's condition, and she saw the masts had broken clean off, the sails were now dragging in the water, the engine, the radio, the electronic navigation system, the emergency position indicator device, all of it was ruined. And so all alone in the middle of the ocean with nothing in sight, no ships, no land, no anything, on a ruined ship that is gradually sinking, after finding out your fiance has been swept out to his death in the middle of a storm, Tammy managed to stay composed, and she built a makeshift sail and began sailing the ship, and she also began slowly pumping the water out of the cabin. She went back into the cabin and she discovered some of the almanacs were still in there, and she discovered there was a current that she thought she could get to, and so using just a sextant and a watch, she manually navigated this broken down ship using this makeshift sail into this current, and then for 41 days she survived on canned food and peanut butter, and she sailed 1,500 miles to Hawaii. And the whole time she's thinking to herself, if my calculations are off, that this is not the current I'm supposed to be in, I will sail past Hawaii out into the open water, and I will run out of food and water and I will die. But she didn't die because her calculations were spot on. When Tammy finally stepped foot on land in Hawaii, she was relieved that, she had made it and that she was going to live. But at the same time, she had this flood of emotions where she was suddenly so sad about the loss of Richard. It was like she really hadn't had a chance to grieve his loss, because that whole time after the accident, she was focused on survival. And although Tammy would make a full recovery, it would take her 6 years to learn how to read again because of the head injury she sustained when the boat capsized. But when she did regain that skill, she finally stopped, and she wrote her and Richard's story in a book called Red Sky and Morning that became an international bestseller and was converted into a movie called Adrift. Growing up in southeastern Australia, Ricky McGee worked a variety of jobs, including being a carpet salesman, a prawn fisherman, a nightclub doorman, an electrician, and a bailiff. In 2006, when Ricky was 35, he was offered yet another new job in a government department in Western Australia. He accepted the job, hopped in his car, and began the long drive across the desert. While on the extremely desolate Bunteen Highway, which is basically a road in the middle of the desert with nothing around, no people, no buildings, nothing, he's driving along and he sees a group of 3 men standing outside of their car. And so Ricky assumed they must have broken down, so he pulls over to ask if they need help. And they come up to him and they're so gracious that he stopped, and they said, "We ran out of gas, can we hop in with you and ride up to the next town?" And Ricky says, "Fine, climb on in." So the 3 men, they get in his car and they take off. And then after that, Ricky has no memory. He thinks one of them drugged him by putting something in his drink, which was sitting in the center console and was open, but he doesn't know for sure. Ricky remembers waking up and he was in a camp, and he sat up and he was unrestrained, and he looks out in front of him, and the 3 guys that had gotten in the car with him were sitting on rocks looking at him, and one of them had a gun that he was aiming at Ricky. And so Ricky's just looking around, not really sure what's going on, and one of them gets up and comes over and offers him water. Ricky takes a sip of the water because he's very thirsty, and Ricky believes the water was poisoned as well, because shortly after taking a sip, he passed out again. When Ricky regained consciousness a second time, he couldn't move. It was dark and he felt something tugging at his skin, and as he's laying there, he realizes there is black plastic right over his face. He's been buried. And then he realizes there is a dingo that is standing on his chest that has tugged the plastic away from his face, because the dog is trying to take a bite out of Ricky, but the dog is the one that saved his life by creating an air pocket in the plastic. Ricky screamed at the dog panicked and leapt out of the hole and ran away, and Ricky was able to work his finger up to this hole and pull it all the way open and push himself out of the plastic, and he realized there wasn't much dirt or rocks that had been placed over him. They probably thought he would just suffocate in the middle of the desert and no one's going to find him anyways, but here he is. And so he stands up in his grave and he looks around, and there's no sign of the 3 men. His car is gone. He realizes they also took all of his clothing, even his shoes. He's got no food. He's got no water. He's in the middle of the desert. There's no roads. There's no people. There's no buildings. There's nothing. At this point, confusion overtook Ricky, because he just could not make sense of what had just happened to him. Who were these 3 people? Why'd they attack him? Did they just want to steal his car? Were they prepared to kill him to take his car? He couldn't understand it. And so there was some shade behind a little bush, and he sat down in the shade and he just sat there for several hours thinking, what am I going to do? But not being one to let pessimism crowd his psyche, Ricky decides if he's going to survive, he needs to get up and get moving. After 10 days of just wandering through the desert and seeing nobody, he came across this fairly large water hole, and he decided, I have a better chance of surviving if I just wait here until someone comes and rescues me than if I just keep walking through the desert where I'm time bound to just eventually die. And so he makes a makeshift shelter next to this water hole and he begins to wait. After almost a week of being at the spot, Ricky had still not had a single thing to eat since this whole ordeal began. And so he's sitting there, his stomach is in knots, he's in so much pain, he's starving. And just then a lizard happened to run across in front of him, and without even thinking, he just reached out and grabbed it and took a bite out of it. And it was like all of a sudden this primal side of him was unleashed, and suddenly he had no issues eating anything that moved in the desert. For weeks, Ricky stayed at the spot drinking from the water hole and eating lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, caterpillars, basically anything that moved anywhere in the desert, he would chase it down and he would eat it. In fact, he developed an affinity for certain frogs over others, and he said in terms of eating leeches that they were okay, but you needed to eat them really, really quickly, otherwise they would attach to the insides of your mouth. Ricky also ate plants, but he would even say he had no idea what was harmful and what was okay to eat. He just ate what tasted good and got really lucky. But as much as Ricky was eating, it wasn't enough. He was slowly losing his battle with the desert, and he was starving to death. And so Ricky believed he didn't have enough time to just continue to wait at this particular spot. He needed to go out and find help. And so he left that water hole and began stumbling through the desert all over again. But he was so weak, he only lasted for a couple of days before he found another water hole, and he stopped there and he built yet another shelter, this time believing it would become his tomb. Over the next couple of days, wild dogs began coming to his camp and circling his camp. It was like they knew he was about to die soon, or they at least knew he was weak enough they could probably overpower him soon. At night, Ricky had to barricade the door of his shelter because the dogs would get aggressive and they'd come up to the door and try to paw their way inside. On the 70th day of his ordeal, Ricky believed he was probably within a day or two of passing away, and so he put a cross on the outside of his shelter, believing that would be his tomb, and at least this way someone might notice it and find his body, and then hopefully let his family know what happened to him. But on the 71st day, when Ricky happened to be standing outside of his shelter, two ranch hands happened to be way off the road in the outback and were looking in his direction, and they saw him. And when they went over to him, they said he looked like a walking skeleton, and Ricky practically collapsed as soon as he saw help had finally arrived. The ranch hands evacuated Ricky from the desert and brought him to a hospital where he weighed less than 100 pounds. At the beginning of his ordeal, he weighed over 230 pounds. Despite filing a report with the police about the three men who attacked him, they were never caught. Ricky checked himself out of the hospital after 6 days and made a full recovery. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and he now works construction in Dubai. By 1985, the remote and extremely dangerous west face of the Ciudad Grande in the Peruvian Andes was still unclimbed. But in 1985, two very ambitious climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, decided they were going to be the first to conquer it. And by all accounts, they seemed up for the job, having already conquered numerous difficult Scottish ice cliffs, as well as a number of large mountain faces in the Alps. So in early June of that year, the pair flew to Peru, and they arrived at the base camp that was nearest to the Ciudad Grande, but it was still 5 miles away, so they couldn't actually see what they were going to be climbing yet. On June 5th, when the weather was good enough, the pair left camp and worked their way around the huge lake, across the glacier, to the base of this cliff they're about to climb, and when they saw it for the first time, they couldn't believe how steep and dangerous it looked. But over the next 3 days, they managed to make it up this cliff despite a blizzard hitting them halfway through, and they reached the summit. To them, this was a crowning achievement. They had done it. They had written their names in the history books. But in reality, the thing that people would remember them for was not for reaching the top of Ciudad Grande. It was for what happened when they started going down. Because of how steep this mountain was, and because of the blizzard that was not going away, it was actually getting worse, the descent was going to be much more challenging than the ascent. So shortly after 10 a.m. on June 8th, Joe and Simon left the summit and began very carefully making their way down the mountain. At 11 a.m., disaster struck when Joe lost his footing and fell to the bottom of an ice cliff and shattered his leg. Initially, they both assumed this was a death sentence for Joe, because there's no way he can actually climb down the mountain now, and certainly Simon can't actually carry him down the mountain. They were so high up, and it's so steep, there's just no way. But Simon wanted to at least try to save his friend, so he climbed down to him, he gave him some mild painkillers that he had, and then he attached his rope to Joe, and then Simon anchored himself in the snow, and he began lowering Joe down the mountain, all 300 feet of his rope, and when he would stop, Joe at the other end would would anchor himself in the snow with his ice picks, and then Simon would climb down to Joe and he'd repeat the process over and over and over again, lowering Joe 300 feet at a time. This went on for hours and hours and hours, just backbreaking work for Simon, and Joe, meanwhile, is in excruciating pain from his broken leg. And to make matters worse, the storm had gotten so bad that the visibility between Simon and Joe was zero. So as Simon is lowering Joe, he can't see what he's lowering Joe onto, but they had no other choice. That was the only way they could get him down. And so at 5 p.m. that night, Simon accidentally lowers Joe over a cliff. And Joe, as soon as he's hanging off the edge, all of his weight is on the rope, and suddenly the rope is flying out of Simon's hands, and he manages to self-arrest and stop him from careening over the edge. But now Simon is the only thing holding Joe from tumbling to his death. And Simon is being slowly drugged down the mountain. He can't anchor himself in. And so they're in the middle of this inhospitable environment. In the middle of the night, a storm is raging. It's freezing cold. They can't communicate with each other. They can't hear each other or see each other. And Simon is just hoping that Joe is going to be able to grab onto something and kind of take his weight off the rope. Otherwise, this is going to end badly for both of them. But unfortunately, the cliff was at an angle, so Joe was dangling off of it and he couldn't touch the wall. He had nothing to grab onto. He was just dangling in the air. And so as Simon tries to move the rope to try to signal to Joe to take your weight off the rope, Joe is trying to climb up the rope, but his hands are starting to get frostbit. He's weak, he's in pain, he can't do anything about it. So for the next 2.5 hours, Simon is desperately trying to regain an anchor in the snow, but every second that goes by, he's getting pulled farther and farther and farther down the mountain. He can't see how close he is to the edge. He knows he's getting close. And so finally at 7:30 p.m. with no other option, he pulls out a knife and he cuts the rope. As soon as the rope was cut, Simon fell backwards. He was safe. Nothing was pulling him off the cliff any longer, but he knew he had just sent Joe to his death. Except Joe didn't die. When that rope was cut, he fell 150 feet and smashed into the ground, except what he hit was a thin sheet of ice that broke from his weight, and he fell another 80 feet into this massive ice crevasse. Joe was knocked unconscious from the fall, but when he woke up, he was laying on his side. He opened his eyes and he looked around and he couldn't believe he was alive. And he's looking around, he doesn't know where he is, it's totally dark. He turns on his headlamp and he realizes he's fallen into an ice crevasse, and he looks down and he's on this little ledge that's overlooking a much, much deeper fall. He looks down and this ice crevasse seems to just go on infinitely into this black chasm. And he realizes when he fell, had he fallen a foot over, that's where he would have gone. So it's a miracle he's alive, but now he's trapped in the middle of an ice crevasse 80 feet down. He can't go down and he can't go up. At the time, Joe didn't know if Simon had fallen off the cliff with him or if he had cut the rope. But the rope was still attached to his waist and it fed up and out of the ice crevasse. And so he grabbed it and pulled on it until it all came tumbling back down and he saw it was frayed. And so sure enough, Simon had cut the rope. Now, even though Joe wasn't mad at Simon for the decision he made because he understood it was the right one, Joe still became very emotional when he saw this. He felt so alone. He was so sad. And for a little while, he just kind of freaked out and screamed and yelled and really just didn't know what he was going to do. And then after that, he sat down knowing he wasn't getting out of here and that he was going to die a slow, horrible, painful death. Joe remembers reaching up and turning off his headlamp, which retrospectively he thought was kind of goofy because he's just realized he's about to die inside of this crevasse and he's saving batteries. But with the light off, he's sitting on the ledge and he hears all the sounds that are coming from inside of this crevasse. It was this awful grinding sound, like a moaning sound, that he said it was so terrifying sitting in the darkness listening to this sound that he reached up and turned his light back on just for comfort. Back up on the mountain, Simon was devastated. He felt like he had just killed his friend, and even though he understood why he did it and understood it was probably the right decision, it didn't change the fact that he felt incredibly guilty about it. And so that night, he didn't even move from the position he was. He dug a little snow cave and he laid down and eventually fell asleep. The next morning when he got up, he began moving his way down the mountain and he finally rounded the area where Joe had been hanging off of that cliff, and he got a chance to look down and see where Joe might have wound up. And to his horror, he's looking down and he sees this massive opening to a crevasse that seemed almost bottomless. And now this confirms that Joe definitely has died because he fell in there. But nonetheless, Simon goes down and goes to the edge of the crevasse and yells into Joe. He's screaming for him to call out if he's still alive. But after a while, he never heard anything from Joe. And With a heavy heart, Simon turned around and started heading back to base camp. A little while after Simon had left, Joe finally woke up. He had been asleep when Simon was yelling down for him. And so Joe wakes up, he's looking around, he can't believe this wasn't a bad dream. He starts yelling for Simon because he doesn't know what else to do. But after a while, he realized Simon's not going to come down here to get me. He cut the rope. He thinks I'm dead already. At this point, Joe decides he needs to try to climb out of the crevasse, even with a broken leg. And so he gets himself in position, he gets his ice picks, and he starts making his way up this ice wall, but he can't put any weight on his broken leg, and he keeps falling down, and he's realizing, I can't climb this. I probably couldn't climb this with two good legs, let alone with this broken one. And so Joe had two choices. He could wait on the ledge and hope to be rescued, but by his calculations, it was unlikely someone was going to come out here and rescue him anytime soon, because Simon is going to say he's dead. So wait on the ledge and probably die a slow, painful death. Or he can go down deeper into the crevasse, which he has no idea where it goes, and hope somewhere down in that black void there's an opening that leads back out to the outside of the mountain. So he made his choice, screwed an anchor into the ice, put his rope through it. He tested it to make sure it would hold his weight. He looked down into the void one last time and knew that as soon as he stepped off of this ledge, he could not come back up again. This was a one-way trip. And if he made it to the bottom of his 300-foot rope and he didn't find a ledge or a tunnel or something to put his feet on, he would slip off and fall to his death. On purpose, he did not put a knot at the end of his rope because he figured either I'll find a way out or I won't, but at least it'll be quick. Down he went about 80 feet into this pitch black crevasse. He has no idea what's down there. And he gets to a point where the walls kind of come together and he was able to squeeze through it. And he realized once he got through that point, it was like the center of an hourglass where below it, it kind of opened up. And as soon as he pushed through, he could actually see to the ground. He saw flat ground and there was light shining on it, which meant there was a hole leading out into the mountains somewhere down there. And so he went all the way down, he touched the bottom, it was solid ground, he disconnected from his rope, and he climbed his way up this incline to where the sun was coming in, which was this hole that led right back out onto the mountain. And sure enough, he crawled out and tumbled out, and the sun is shining on him, and he remembers just laying on the mountain, looking at the sun and laughing. He couldn't believe it. But after the initial relief of not dying wore off, he realized he was not out of the woods yet. He still needed to climb down the rest of the mountain, and there wasn't that much left to climb. He was towards the bottom, and it wasn't that steep. But after that, he would need to navigate 5 miles back to base camp. But over several delirious, painful, miserable days, he managed to crawl all the way back to base camp, and he got there right as Simon was packing up the tent and getting ready to leave. He could not believe he saw Joe alive. Joe said Simon just swore. He just endlessly swore. He was cussing. He couldn't even speak. He didn't understand. It was like he was looking at a ghost. But after that kind of crazy initial interaction, Simon just gave Joe a big hug, and Joe and Simon just cried and held each other. Joe underwent 6 surgical operations to repair the damage done to his leg, and doctors would tell him that you're never going to climb again, and you're probably going to struggle with walking for the rest of your life. But after 2 years of intense rehabilitation, Joe was not only walking just fine, he was mountain climbing. As for Simon, he managed to leave the mountain without any serious physical injury, but he carried with him an enormous sense of guilt that he still carries today. Joe consistently says Simon made the right decision. In every interview he does, he always makes sure to say, Simon is not at fault. It was an impossible situation. He made the right call. Joe wrote a book about the experience called Touching the Void, and it sold millions of copies worldwide and has since been adapted into a major motion picture. As for Joe and Simon, apparently they've drifted apart over the years, but they still consider each other friends. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments.
comments what it is and where you found it. If you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly follow the like button into a grocery store and then ram the back of their heels with your grocery cart. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My